Hello, ladies and gentlemen, dear listeners. It has again been a few months since the last podcast we did.
I'm a very rare treat.
Yes, we need to keep you, deal you out in doses before you cause people to commit suicide. I mean, you are pretty heavy on the black pill, and today we're going to talk about another black pilling topic.
Well, it depends.
It depends on how you look at it, I guess. But we kind of got started on this topic with, just general conversations. But we both noticed a trend that we see more and more people becoming anti-institutional.
Yeah, and it's become a lot more apparent with the disease that shall not be named, right?
Yes, that's been a catalysator for a lot of people. But also, for example, that Rabobank guy who writes for Zero Hedge and other people like that. You notice a lot of people...
Michael.
Yes, Michael Avery, who is a top guy for the Rabobank. Asian markets, chief Asian markets. And he is... He writes for Zero Hedge, quite radical stuff, very anti-system stuff from an economics point of view. And you notice this is something we both notice more and more, that more high-placed, more wealthy, well-to-do, intelligent people have becoming radicalized. And of course we observed this a few years ago with the alt-right and all that, but this time it's different things.
And I would say, because people like to say, well, the elites, the 1%, but the 1%, you only need like a million euros or something to be 1% household in the Netherlands, for example.
Yes.
And I mean, those are not going to Davos.
No.
So there's a lot of guys that are outside of the 0.001% or whatever,
but who are still relatively wealthy, have their own businesses,
who
or
are
degrees, or competent.
Exactly, but they're on the wrong side of the
wealth transfer,
of the Great Reset, and all this stuff, just as much as we are. Well, maybe a little bit less so, but they'll still be fucked, you know.
And they notice that things are like for one of the examples was with doctors, having their doubts about.
So an example of an elite, there's a number of guys. I mean, take for example the Great Barrington Declaration, right? The guys that were behind that. They're not. What they said wasn't even that radical, and it wasn't like they were totally outcast. Like the guys who say ivermectin works, those guys are outcast. Oh shit.
Oh well.
The drug that shall not be named. Yes. No, we really have to cut that out.
Yeah, we have to be careful talking about the whole. Pandemic stuff, because that's just so easy for you to censor you on.
Yeah, it's just particular words that they scan for.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So either way, there's but the Great Barrington Declaration guys, they just didn't want like the full lockdown. They only wanted like a localized lockdown. That's all they wanted. They basically just wanted to keep the elderly and the people with diabetes and etc. They wanted to keep those guys at home and then let all of us youngsters run around and catch the disease so that we would get herd immunity faster. And that was their idea. And they all based it in pretty good science. I mean, for the longest time in epidemiology, it was, as far as I understand, basically the consensus that full lockdowns like we did right now were not very useful and probably did more harm than good, as it is starting to look like has happened.
Yes.
So basically these guys were just saying, well, what are we doing? We did all this science and we had these protocols, and now we're doing something completely different. What's happening? So that's all. And and they got so much pushback that that was
so you got
a wake-up call.
Doctors on, for example, the pandemic are one example. Economists with central banks, that's
but of course there's always been a select group
but that's
been
a
complaining
broader
about
and broader
it.
sentiment.
But an increasing number of people are like, well, this is absolutely nuts. That's
exactly. And you've got the example of the French generals writing a letter to the crown, for example. So there's a lot of these examples of people basically starting anti-system thinking, high-placed people with
lawyers, with
for here in the Netherlands, for example, the Order van Advocaten, I guess the Lawyers Guild would be the English term. They were they weren't very happy about the the unconstitutional, essentially, emergency laws.
Yeah, how about our king? Our king has been kind of away from microphones for a while because it seems his opinion isn't.
The king apparently is not very happy with the lockdowns either.
In the few times he got a chance to speak, he said stuff like, "Well, we do have to take care that we don't lose our system, our civil systems of law," or I forget what exactly.
The rule of law, essentially.
It's not exactly like human rights.
And he flaunted pandemic regulations a couple of times, very, very deliberately. So kind of like the king seems to be not very happy with this. So.
Beast monarch.
Then again, I think our king would be happiest if he could be like, I don't know, a farmer and then have beer and watch football. So I don't think
he's that low culture, but yeah.
Our king's very he's not like
he's a bit too much of a man of the common people.
Yeah, a man of the people. Yeah, wish he had more opportunities to express it. But anyway, that's a lot of these examples. But the one thing was it's not racial, like. Ethnicity and race does not really play a role in
Black Lives Matter thing is a little bit of a thing, but it's more like, oh, it's ridiculous all this stuff, you know. It's like the response of the public is not of the white middle class public is not. I mean, they are being attacked for being white, but if you compare it to the direction that we were starting to go at the start of this whole movement, like 8 years ago or something. It started with stuff like the PVV in the Netherlands, where it was really like we have to kick the Moroccans and the Turks out, and then things will be good. That was kind of the sentiment.
And for a lot of the listeners here, they were of course red-pilled over the 2015 migrant crisis, for example, the 2016 Trump campaign, these sorts of things, where ethnicity and race played a huge role, migration played a huge role, but we don't hear as much rhetoric about migration anymore. Maybe this is simply because it's become normalized, right?
No, the rhetoric has shifted. So now the rhetoric has shifted from, oh, we don't want these people in our country, to, oh, critical race theory is the problem.
Yes.
Anytime it's about other ethnicities, and it's about, you know, the fact that white people commit less crime or whatever, right? Or that blacks are being confronted by the police more. People, the response is now not like, oh, that's why we don't want them here. The response is like, well, that's why we have the police and these crazy Marxists or whatever. They want to get rid of our police, and the debate has shifted away from whether we. Although the PVV still gets a lot of votes, right? So it's not like this sentiment has disappeared. But in the public debate, it's...
But again, I think that has to do with the fact that discourse has become, to an extent, normalized. It's just normal for a right-wing populist party to be opposed to migration at this
point. That's also true. And it's like, we're talking about different stuff. And it's also that there's so much more crazy shit going on.
Yeah, exactly. Like race and IQ are topics that used to be big back in 2016. We needed to convince people that race was real and mattered, but now it's like we kind of need to convince people more that what the central banks are doing is evil, and that the lockdowns are maybe a bit exaggerated.
It's also because the problem horizon of having these different ethnicities here, the horizon on which that's going to become a problem is probably longer than.
Well, it's already a problem.
Well, okay, yeah, but that's like just like the debt and the printing is already a problem. But the rates at which these things are spinning out of control are totally different.
Sure. It's not like we've got race riots or anything.
No, it's going to take.
We do have massive wealth transfers.
So the rate at which that would spin out of control is like on a scale of decades, whilst the rate at which this Great Reset game is going to spin out of control is more like this decade.
Yes. And so we get to the fourth turning, which is how you sort of frame this.
Well, yeah, it's a useful tool. So there were these two guys. I mean, you've all heard of the term boomer and Gen Xer and millennial and all this stuff, and it's not as though these guys came up with it, but they really popularized this way of thinking thinking about generations in these blocks of 20 years with different subcultures and different behaviors. And so there were two guys, William Strauss and Neil Howe, some of you might have heard of this, and some of you might have heard of the fourth turning, and it's they basically have a model that kind of fits on the Anglo history.
It's based on Anglo-Saxon history, so it doesn't always fit other historical.
Well, the concept fits more broadly. I have read some people that try to fit it on Germanic and continental Europe, but the problem is that we'll get to that later. Well, so the idea is of the fourth turning is that there's basically 4 turnings within a block of 80 years, or the span of a long human life. That's what they basically say. And these 4 blocks are 4 generations, right? And so every 80 to 90 years, which is the span of a long human life, one of these blocks ends, and you start with a new block.
It's basically cyclical idea of cyclical history, but instead of Spengler's analysis, it's about civilizations.
Yeah.
And the Strauss-Howe generational theory, as it's also known, is more about
generations
within civilization changes.
Yeah, and it's really focused on generations basically, because its basic idea is that every 80 to 90 years, every 80 to 90 years you have a bad event, a crisis, or a series of crises, and then most big institutions are either seriously reformed, or broken down and completely new ones are made.
The most recent one, and which is the primary example they use, is the Second World War and the generations afterwards. But they also fit in multiple models, like the Glorious Revolution being a turning and then starting a new institution.
Yeah, so we could
the Napoleonic War.
So if you go back, So if you go further back, but basically going back, I mean, I'm going to miss one, and somebody's going to say, that's a gap of 160 years. But if you go back, so it's like Second World War, and then you've got American independence, I think.
Not Napoleon?
No, Napoleon is farther back.
Anglo-Saxon, of course. No, Napoleon's later than the Revolution.
Oh yeah, you're right.
But
so it's American independence and American Civil War, then American independence if you go farther back, and there was a couple. I should actually. Revolution. Yeah. If you go, here I might have them actually. So here we go. The Great Depression and Second World War, the American Civil War, the American Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, the Armada Crisis, and the War of the Roses.
Right. Again, it's all Anglo-Saxon based, but
yes. and then ours should start in 2005 and end somewhere in 2026. But this is totally not very clearly defined. Also, because
pretty arbitrary place to be.
Yeah, exactly. So you can shift this window around by like 8 years, something like that.
But the whole thing about the fourth turning essentially is after a crisis, people establish institutions to deal with the previous crisis. So after the Second World War, we got the United Nations, we got the European Union,
NATO,
and so on to prevent the European war.
And then over the course of time, the based generation that set up these institutions, they fought through the Second World War. They were like, okay, this was horrible. Let's not do this again. I mean. And so they're like the hard times that created the hard men or the strong men, and they create their institutions, and then they hand down the institutions over generations, and basically the generation the last generation to really fuck up the institutions in our case was the boomers, right? And it's always that generation in the loop. And then
they start repurposing it. So, for example, where the UN was started as just a place for nations to have a discussion to avoid war, it's become sort of a international law has become more important than sovereign than national state law and a lot of things. For example,
it's basically bureaucratic and technocratic control slipping in our case, but generally it's this idea of exactly just bureaucracy slowly increasing to the point of institutions becoming ineffective and them also losing their original the whole point. I mean, nobody who wants to stay in the European Union, for example, except for my grandparents and maybe some other old people, are saying, well, we really, even though it's inefficient, we really have to stay in because otherwise France and Germany might go to war again.
Yeah.
That's not, but that was one of the reasons to have it in the first place.
One of the primary reasons.
Yeah, exactly. So these original reasons will go lost. And I mean, and our generation and Gen Z will sit there and, well, I'm kind of Gen Z anyway, but our generation will sit there and say, well, we can do without the European Union, and then France and Germany will go to war again, you know? They are not exactly, but this is something that might happen in a fourth turning, right?
Yeah, so in the fourth turning, young minds start criticizing the institutions, like creative people and so on don't see the use of a lot of institutions because they're corrupted. So revolutionary thought sort of starts spreading.
Well, there's two places in the cycle where this kind of happens. So there's I think it's the artist generation in the cycle. Well, we shouldn't go into too much depth, but don't forget this also happens in the 60s. So there's this cycle of collectivism and individualism, and around the crisis, collectivism steeply increases again, and then with collective power we put together all these institutions, and then when times get good because we put all this stuff together and we created a functioning society, then the next generation that gets born, because the parents are all tired from putting together these institutions, they are the fucked up generation, right? So as the youth they already start protesting against all these collective rules and but
to give a couple examples of how it corrupts over time, like anti-racism was one of the pillars of the post-World War order because, you know, that was what caused the war, supposedly, right? Racism. And now anti-racism has become a complete parody of itself, where it's just become a whole ideological system of hating white people and anti-colonialist thought and so on. And another thing, for example, is with central banks. Well, to be perfectly honest, I believe central banks were always planned to be evil institutions to corrupt the world.
I don't think I don't think there's that dark a plan, but they were useful in the end.
They were started after a bunch of economic crises, especially in the 1900s. There were a lot of hefty economic crises, and
you know they sunk the Titanic just to get rid of the one guy that was going to debate about the.
Sure. That's one of those conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it's a crazy one.
But anyway, central banks once were started with the idea we've got to, you know, smooth the bumps out of the cycles of capitalism, and nowadays it's just creating such perverse incentives that big companies don't want to have a good balance sheet anymore. They don't want to have cash reserves because they know the government will just build them out, so they'll pay out more dividends to their. That's one of the things that's been happening in the Netherlands.
No, you don't pay out dividends. You take on loans to buy back more of your own stock. Paying out dividends would be much too sensible.
Yes, yeah, well, also true. But anyway, central banks at this point are complete parodies of themselves who are just there to facilitate economic control. For elite power, and economists are noticing that as well. You know, a lot of people criticizing that.
And this started with the Tea Party, of course, but it's taken on way more people that thought the Tea Party was ridiculous at the start, and to be honest, they were a little bit crazy as well.
Sure. But there's just two examples of institutions, or at least ideologies that were foundational, becoming corrupted.
Yeah. So and it doesn't necessarily even have to be explicitly corrupted. I mean, this turning seems to me that it's going to be particularly. I suppose things can always be. I don't think it would be. I don't think it's going to cost as much lives as the Second World War, but it's been particularly gross. This one, it's been particularly undercover and not explicit, whilst previous ones. If you go back in history, there were more clearly cut out camps.
The student revolution of '68, for example, that's a lot more visible than what's happening on the internet right now with dissident movements and anti-COVID and whatever thinking that goes around. But all of those are examples of anti-system thinking of in some way the system failing people, whether that's migration, whether that's economic purchasing power, whether that's the lockdowns and healthcare.
So to give you guys an idea of what these guys were thinking of, they wrote a book, William Strauss and Neil Howe, and the book was written in 1998, the first edition,
so
right?
Before the Twin Towers,
particular
before the economic
events.
crisis of 2008, before any of the stuff of the recent decades. Like this book was written when a few years after Francis Fukuyama, back when really America was confident they had now finally defeated the Soviets, they were going to dominate the world, liberalism was going to triumph. So it was very anti-system at the time to think that that the West could ever collapse, because to the mainstream at the time, it seemed the West was in its glory days. It had no more enemies. Liberalism was going to be the way the world was going to be.
The Whig view of history. Yes. And they sketch out some possible things that might happen. You know, it's not like they say this particular thing it will happen, but they just wanted to sketch out what kind of thing you might start to think about, right? So here's a couple scenarios. Beset by a financial crisis, a state lays claim to its residents' federal tax monies. Declaring this an act of secession, the president obtains a federal injunction. The governor refuses to back down. Federal marshals enforce the court order. Similar tax rebellions spring up in other states. Treasury bill auctions are suspended. Militia violence breaks out. Cyber terrorists destroy IRS databases. US special forces are put on alert. Demands issue for a new constitutional convention. So this doesn't really track.
No. The thing is, with all of these, they start with one point and escalate to where it would total collapse. A lot of these examples, there are examples of something like that happening. For example, the standoff in, I think it was Washington State or Minnesota, between ranchers and the federal government, where the federal government eventually was kicked out by the state governments this was over the use of federal land for grazing, I believe it was. But that's an example of, American states revolting against their federal government.
What about Texas saying, well, maybe we should split off because we don't like the election results?
The disputed election results are one of those examples.
Exactly.
Very much.
But, and what we should say is, if anything, the thing about the fourth turning is because of these institutions are such a mess, stuff that normally would have been handled just fine now spins out of control. That's why it's not as though these events don't happen more often also within other periods outside of this particular 20-year
contested
window.
Elections where people allege fraud have happened.
It just happens all the time. Exactly.
Many times.
But around the fourth turning, trust and competence is so low that these things are just more of an issue, and then they're all of a sudden just a catalyst for more problems.
More people are prone to distrust the system because the system has failed them on so many things.
Exactly. So here's another example. Just one they pick out of the air as an idea. Yeah. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announces the spread of a new communicable virus. The disease reaches densely populated areas, killing some. Congress enacts mandatory quarantine measures. The president orders the National Guard to throw prophylactic cordons around unsafe neighborhoods. Mayors resist. Urban gangs battle suburban militias. Calls mount for the president to declare martial law.
Well, that last part did happen, and the first part happened, but of course everything in between, no.
No, the urban gangs battling suburban militias.
Well, I guess no, but to an extent you could say the Black Lives Matter riots.
They were quite gangy and
quite violent. The only thing that didn't happen is that there were rival gangs. There was barely any opposition to them.
No. Well, the suburban militias just stood next to their houses in some cases, right?
Yeah. And just didn't do much.
No.
But there were the militias. They were there.
But I mean, this is stretching it. It's just that but I was surprised. But here's another one that's particularly interesting. And remember, this was written before the whole weapons of mass destruction, the whole thing, right?
Before Bush was even president.
Yeah, so here. A global terrorist group blows up an aircraft and announces it possesses portable nuclear weapons. The United States and its allies launch a preemptive strike. The terrorists threaten to retaliate against an American city. Congress declares war and authorizes unlimited house-to-house searches. Opponents charge that the president concocted the emergency for political purposes. A nationwide strike is declared. Foreign capital flees the US. And they have a couple more, but and some of these are also, to certain levels of fitting the current time. But the point is that amount of debt that we build up, and low public trust and not very competent public institutions basically continually results in overblown responses to minor to serious.
Just look at
problems.
how the media deals with some things, right? For example, with accusing everyone of being a white nationalist, beating that up. Like it almost seems like the media has made a hobby out of trying to create scare panics among the public.
Well, and I mean it makes sense because that's how they get clicks, right? So there's a perverse incentive there as well.
Sure, but I think it's also about power and control. If people are fighting each other or scared of things,
that's completely. But if we just assume there's no financial backer in the back pushing them in that direction, without that, there's already enough incentive for them to do so. Because in the whole coronavirus scare, they got the best clicks and views that they could ever have gotten, and around the whole Trump is a horrible person thing, they always get their clicks. So it's also just from a self-interested perspective good for them.
But it is polemicizing society very much.
Yeah, exactly. Of course. Yeah.
And I think the media can be blamed for a large part in accelerating this whole process.
Yeah, and I thank them.
To an extent, that's true. I mean, I guess you could be accelerationist in the sense that...
Well, this is exactly what... that's what we are getting to, right? So when we were... because this is just my view is... I'm not sure about the whole fourth turning thing, but it seems to me that it's looking very much like it's happening again, right? And
well, one thing we can absolutely say is that the West currently is in crisis, a moral crisis, an ideological crisis.
Yeah, and it just coincidentally seems to reach a peak around this whole around the 80 to 90 year mark since the last one was resolved.
Yeah.
So that seems like, well, it seems like.
We are still in the beginning phases to an extent.
Well, no, according to the scheme, and this is also you should remember. So the Second World War one, if I just grab it real quick, it started like in 1929, right? And it was resolved in 1946, according to them. Mm-hmm. So if you look at 1929. The halfway mark would be 1930. No, 19 what? 1935 or something like that. 1937.
Well, that's one of the things where I'm going to disagree with them, because I find that, again, they are a very Anglo-Saxon perspective. I think the whole crisis around the Second World War started with the First World War. Well, and the whole process of that crisis took about 30 years.
Yeah, okay, so you stretch it a bit. Yeah, that's fair. Some people say that that our fourth turning, this one, started in 2008 with the great financial crisis. But I think you can stretch that to the 2002 .com bubble as well if you wanted to.
Sure. Yeah, or to 9/11, where institutions started to obviously take immoral actions against the consent of the people, because there were massive anti-war protests, of course. Everywhere.
Yeah, and then there was this whole weapons of mass destruction
which was a complete lie, which everyone admits now.
Which for political purposes, one might say.
Yeah, that's the interesting part.
Yeah, okay, but so this is what I see, and typically in a fourth turning, one by one, different professions and different subgroups, they get alarmed by things that are happening, and this was what was,
this is what we were pointing out at the beginning. Yes. Economists and medical professionals.
Yeah, let's say we take the lockdowns around a disease that shall not be named. So what started with just some
skeptics?
Yeah, some skeptics around whether these lockdowns were all that effective, and then some people saying, hold on, there's this data about this alternative prophylactic and medicine. That seems it's not alternative. It was like a medicine that was already
on the market,
used by the WHO for like river blindness disease and a bunch of other things. It was one of the most dosed things in the world, actually. And so it was very strange, all this response, and the doctors that by coincidence knew about this particular drug, they were very confused by this. It's not safe. What are you talking about? It's not safe, And one by one, people that have a particular speciality that opposes the narrative, they just get confused, and then they start looking around.
There's this phenomenon. It has a name in psychology, but I forget what
Cognitive, you mean dissociative?
Something like that. But it's where, for example, if you read a newspaper and you read an article about your particular specialization...
Oh, no, that's a different thing, right?
So, for example, if you are an economist and you read a piece about economy, 99% of the time a newspaper will either be simplistic about it or explain it wrong, and the same thing goes for medicine, and so on and so on. And the economist will read the economical piece and say, idiots, they got this wrong. He'll turn the page over, read the medical piece, and think, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
The medical professional will read the economical the piece about economics and think, oh, that's interesting. And then he'll turn over the page, read the medical part, think, oh, that's complete nonsense.
Yeah, but they compartmentalize it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's a particular name for that. I know.
There's a name for that process psychology, but it basically is that even though from the same source you get a lot of things you know are wrong, you still have trust in the institution itself because it has so much reputation. Essentially,
that's one, but it's also that's the unconscious thing. The second part of and that was the thing I thought you were going to at first was cognitive dissonance, and and I think this is causing a lot of cognitive dissonance. In these weird, but that's something that even the common people notice. That's a completely different thing where we go masks, we don't do masks. The disease spreads like this, but we have to stay 2 meters apart. All this stuff, and
remember we discussed in the Red Pill Rage episode that one of the stages of acceptance is denial and bargaining. That's what you see a lot of experts who are faced with a system that's just wrong on things are doing now. They're either denying it, they're bartering, they're going through those stages of basically the Red Pill Rage process.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose stuff like the Great Barrington Declaration is bartering, right? It's like,
yes,
let's
just give us some data-based solutions rather than
whatever we're doing now.
Yeah,
that's true actually.
I think that's more or less what a lot of people right now are going through.
And then you get anger, which you see from some of these guys already.
Yes.
You're right. Like, I don't understand how this could happen. What's all this corruption? What's happening? Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Actually, that's very interesting. There's a documentary that was trying to be made called Planet Lockdown, and they interviewed doctors. I mean, it's. None of it, not all of it, is equally good. Actually, the one thing that surprised me was how based the one of the ruling family members of Liechtenstein was.
Oh, really?
Yeah, actually, very.
More arguments in favor of monarchy.
Well, yes, this actually very much. He really didn't like international agreements and all this stuff. It's worth just listening to his interview actually, but it's nothing you've never heard before. But it's weird to.
You're a Prince of Liechtenstein, say.
Yes, exactly. But either way, there was one of these where, like, I think a doctor from Thailand who moved to Germany for more freedom, etc. He was interviewed somewhere halfway last year, and he was like, "Well, we're still waiting on the data. It's not looking very good, and I'm a bit worried, and all this stuff, And they interviewed him again recently, so there was another interview put up on their website. And it was a world of difference, It was really combative, and quite angry. And he even recorded another 2-minute segment that he wanted to just have them spread around to tell people, like, don't do the vaccine. It's very dangerous, It was, at first he was a lot more wishy-washy on it, It's also that there's more data out, of course. But I think he was
what was
actually
surprising
being
was
mad.
that a few mainstream newspapers published pieces where they had doubts about the vaccine.
Yeah, but it was mostly like, even the Volkskrant did this, but then the conclusion was on a cost-benefit thing, even though we don't have any idea, we don't have enough data at all to do cost-benefit, but it's still, to be safe, that's basically the conclusion you get at the end, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes it feels like throwing all the doubters a bone. We're like, oh yeah, we feel along with your doubts, but don't worry too much. It's like I don't know if it's serious doubt or if it's just strategic.
I don't know. I don't know if people who read the Volkskrant need that kind of assurance, but you never know.
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know. But either way, so yeah. Over the course of this, the Corona thing, you really see this, and there's particular characters that are very interesting to watch, right? Like on the lawyer front, it's the Rainer Fulmich. He was the guy who went after Volkswagen for Dieselgate, and he did some other. He was like one of those liberal guys that were like, we'll get these big corporations that are being all corrupt, you know. And still being a bit skeptical about whether or not they had big institutions in their pockets, kind of, right? And he went all out on the. He started like you were talking, that you hear different lawyers saying a bit worried about the human rights here, about the civil liberties. Yeah. Let's say civil liberties instead of human rights. A bit worried, but if it doesn't take too long, you know. Shit happens, you know. It's just 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, just 2 weeks to
to flatten the curve.
Yes.
But now he's got I think a thing with a couple hundred lawyers signing petitions and shit to do like a class lawsuit against.
Well, that's what disappointed me, is that I know that in the Orde van Advocaten, so that's the Dutch Bar Association, they sent a letter, I believe, to the Raad van State expressing their concerns about. But that wasn't
a strongly worded letter.
Yes. They wrote a strongly worded letter. That they essentially
doesn't hit quite as hard as French generals doing it, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot of people writing strongly worded letters.
But that's the bargaining phase, you know.
That seems to be what it is. Like the French military bargaining with the French civil government, like, please fix this before we have to like have a civil war, and the Dutch Bar Association saying, please stop with this until you undermining of the rule of law and the constitution, so we can have at least a pretense of proper law and order, please.
Yes.
But yeah, but they didn't really follow up very much on that. And considering the lockdowns are being lifted, they probably won't.
Not anymore now. But that depends, right? If we're going to go into this infinite cycle of, oh no, another one, let's do booster shots and another lockdown this winter, because it's also becoming summer, right? And you know, the thing is, the detection method, I don't fully. So there's this whole thing about the number of cycles, and we won't go into too much detail here, but I'm a bit worried that a lot of, you know, if this coronavirus can really mutate into, well, we've already seen it mutate a lot, because I'm fairly because the original variant that hit the Italians, you know, was a lot more deadly, and the genetic strain that's going around the most now is still the UK strain, which was interesting because it was a lot more effective and a bit less deadly. This is basically also always the direction that viruses
viruses don't want to kill you; they want to host.
Yes. Well, they don't even want to make you too sick, right? Because if you're too sick and you stay at home, then you're not spreading it to other people either. The best thing a virus can be, as far as being genetically proliferous, is like the cold. Because then, you know, most people with the cold are like, oh, it sucks, and I'm sneezing all over the place, I'm coughing in people's faces, but you know, I can hold out, I'll go to work, you know, and then you're sneezing in everybody else's face and coughing all over the handles of the door, and then you can really infect a bunch of people, you know. But if you get seriously sick and you are just at home on the couch, you know,
quarantining yourself, essentially.
Not even necessarily on purpose, but just because you feel horrible, well, then you're not giving it to people, right? So the virus the virus with the most evolutionary pressure behind it is the one that makes you feel
which is why we don't have an Ebola pandemic.
Well, and also because Ebola
is spread by very stupid people.
Yeah, basically. But the strain that hit Italy, it was actually quite deadly. I'm fairly convinced, and in China as well. Maybe in China it was even worse, because I wouldn't be. It's hard to convince me that Xi locked down his own economy for
a laugh to troll the West.
Yeah, well, unless it was like a 4D chess move where like, oh, if I lock down, then they'll go completely nuts. That'll happen. You know, it's like some people say this, but I find it hard to believe.
Find that hard to believe as well. The Chinese economy did take a big hit, and they're not like on the most stable basis right now anyway.
And exactly, and the public. I mean, Xi still has to have. I mean, he's pretty sturdy in the saddle there, but he doesn't want to make his population. He
still has to deal with the Uyghurs, with Hong Kong. With the liberalizing population of the big
if
cities.
he ever wants to get Taiwan, you know,
for example, you know, so there's plenty of things for him to do, and he doesn't really have any interest in just going for a lockdown for a laugh, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So I find it easy to believe that it was a bit worse than. But either way, this thing evolves, and now we have this Delta variant, which seems even more infective and probably even less deadly, and so we're just going in this direction, right? But it still gets picked up by all the tests, and so I'm a bit worried that this thing is going to go endemic. Obviously, we're not going to exterminate it. One, because not everybody's going to take the vaccine, and two, because the vaccine isn't effective enough to exterminate the virus like we did with smallpox. You know, so even if everybody took the vaccine, it wouldn't exterminate the disease. And it seems, if I understand correctly, the Delta variant is already
immune to vaccination.
Well, the protein spikes are different enough that your vaccine is probably not that effective, because the vaccine, the mRNA vaccines, are based on the sequence that was isolated from the Chinese and the Italian variant, which is basically not around anymore.
Yeah.
So it's a mess, but then you know, so this is what we were getting to. That this thing is going to come around every year, every winter, because in summer, just like with the flu and
last year we opened up for summer as well.
Exactly, because you get the UV, and especially people's vitamin D levels go up, which is why everybody should be taking vitamin D anyway. It's just generally good practice if you live away from the equator.
Drink a lot of milk. There's a lot of vitamin D in milk.
Yeah, you can go for milk. I don't like milk, but
sunlight will work too.
So, well, I mean, if you're in the winter and you want to get it from sunlight, there's not the sun is on too much of an angle, so you won't get quite enough. So it's just better to just take a small supplement. You don't need much, you know.
2 liters of milk a day.
Yeah, gallon of milk, or you go for like a gallon of soy milk. That also works.
That'll work.
Or you actually get less estrogen in the soy milk, you know.
Sure.
But or don't do the soy milk and just take like the vitamin D pill. It's just generally good practice. It will be good for your testosterone as well.
But since we're talking about China and the whole fourth turning thing, this does seem to be a Western phenomenon. We are in the fourth turning of the West. I don't think China will collapse.
No, so this is what the guys are also talking about in the book, right? And that's that you used to have lots of separate little 85 year cycles, but if people free trade together a lot and you get these overarching
interconnectivity.
Yeah, exactly. There's more interconnectivity, and then the fourth turning becomes bigger, because it's more synchronized fourth turnings at the same time. You can imagine if it was localized to the UK, you know, then it wouldn't be too much of a big deal, because all of our industry could just export stuff to them, and you know, they'll just get more debt or whatever, and it would be fine. But if it's a globalized thing, then it gets really messy. And since we're all part of the American empire, and it's the American cycle that we're on right now.
Yeah, so it's
so Russia and China probably, and Iran, they don't really join in.
Yeah, and my hope is that Europe will be able to pull itself free from America as it, you know, takes a tail dive into its own complete collapse.
Yeah. I mean, America is also on a Spenglerian cycle, it seems.
Yes, they are very much in the winter of their civilization as well. It's not just the fourth turning; it's also just the collapse of their whole. Like what keeps America?
It depends. I mean, Rome took a long time to really.
I'm not saying it'll be over tomorrow, but
But not at the end of this turning, you know.
Maybe not, but you know, America,
I think it might take
America's only held together by its military forces, and militaries do need ideas and ideals to fight for, otherwise you end up just with mercenaries, and mercenaries end up doing what they want.
They need southern white guys that are actually willing to sign up. That's also a big one that they need.
That's true. And the whole thing is like, what unites America anymore? Really, like, is it the
Trump?
Well, it's not the founding fathers, right? It's not Christian identity. Like, what holds them together? It's mostly just commercial ties and some
international trade agreements.
Yeah, some cultural notions. But like, what does someone from like a really hipster area of California have to do with like a redneck area in Alabama? They're completely separate cultures.
They all have Netflix subscriptions.
Well, they all speak English as well, but that's all about it, you know.
Yeah, Netflix and English.
Yes. So I think America is going to collapse, maybe even within this cycle. Maybe it'll take a century. That's harder to predict. But my hope is we as Europe can come to our senses and stop following
I'll put
them.
Good money on that they don't collapse this time. I mean, they're fucked, but it's not that bad yet, you know.
Yeah, well, but if they pull through, it's going to become very dystopian over there.
Oh yeah, obviously.
It's going to be more thought police, more direct you know, harsh.
If only
police.
they had thought police.
They pretty much have thought police at this stage, don't they?
Never mind, you're missing out on the joke.
I mean, the UK is on that way as well. I mean, even over here in the Netherlands, which is relatively sane about these things, we're getting law proposals about, you know...
We'll just all move to Liechtenstein, the last-based micro-state of the...
It'll be like Asterix and Obelix, but from
one small micro-state holding out against the onslaught of international agreements.
Yes. Yeah, that might be the way of the future.
Because they have the based... what's it called? Like the based springing out fresh water that turns people
the magical potion
unwilling to agree to.
they drink clear spring water straight from the Alps, which keeps up their strength.
Yes.
Yes. And now we need to find someone to fall into a cauldron of the stuff when he's young, and then he'll never need it. He can defeat all of the international globalists himself. Oh, yes. The monarchy, the princes of Liechtenstein, defenders against.
And in secret, you know, Alex Jones' mother held him by his ankle and dipped him.
Now you're getting Achilles into it.
And so
Achilles and Siegfried.
And so and so Alex Jones he went to Wodan, and he pointed at all the pebbles on the beach, and Wodan turned all the pebbles on the beach into water filters. So he could take...
So what you're saying is Alex Jones is going to end up killed on a hunting trip after his wife... Well, his wife did divorce him, so yes. After his wife reveals his secret weak spot to his big enemy.
Yes, and then somebody will duct tape a pen to his Achilles heel, and then he'll sign an international agreement with his leg.
Right, we're getting a bit off track. I think we dealt with pretty much what we wanted to talk about. That we're in a fourth turning, West lost its way. If that wasn't obvious to anyone, right?
Yeah, but this model it's interesting, and actually that's the one thing, because it sounds all very black-pilled, but this is the point. I'm seeing these green shoots, and this is the last thing that we wanted to talk about. We're seeing these green shoots, in my opinion, but they're turning not into the alt-right direction. They're turning much more in a civil liberties, libertarian direction, it seems.
Race is not anymore a big topic.
Yeah, so it's turning into, you know, distrust of the Davos crowd and Bill Gates, and you know, and so this central planning that seems to originate from there. That's the big things. The zeitgeist is turning against. You know, the zeitgeist of the people anyway. So it's turning not into our camp, it seems. Although there's of course overlap, because we've been anti-system for a long time, but. Yeah.
I think we will, if the fourth turning ends up being more the libertarian way, there will be more room for our ideas because there'll be more open-mindedness to these sorts of things. But I think there will also be more opposition even to them as well, because maybe they'll be like, sure, yes, race and IQ are correlated and everything, but as soon as you try to make policies based on that, you're being authoritarian. And we just defeated the leftist authoritarians, and now you're coming with rightist authoritarians.
There are not even leftist authoritarians, though, right? I mean, the Davos crowd...
It's more like liberal technocrats.
Yeah, it's the technocrats. That's much more what it is. It's... and they really think that they can manage it. To some degree, I'm not even sure if most of the people who are part of that, you know, I think a lot of them are just... They actually think that it's a good idea, you know. They're convinced.
Of course,
because don't forget, in Davos, for example, there's a bunch of researchers that just are sitting there churning out these bullshit papers that you sometimes see abstracts from on Twitter. Well, you don't see the abstracts exactly. They just make these advertisement videos, right? But most of these advertisement videos are like, you know, public relations for this behind the scenes papers that you can all read. They're all public for the most part.
It's all stuff like more feminism in
well, it's a bunch of things. So of course the stuff we are having problems with is the feminism thing, and but this is why I think they're not like, because they're actually shooting themselves in the foot as ultra rich people to some degree as well, with the with, for example, this ESG stuff in investing. You know, take BlackRock for example, right? BlackRock actually put so much pressure on Shell to stop drilling new oil wells and gas wells that they, so far as I understand, have stopped, because BlackRock has such a large stake, and BlackRock is very much one of these Davos instruments. That's actually just bad for them as investors, you know, because well, the oil price is almost certainly going to go up, and we've already seen it move in the last few months, and it's probably going to move a lot more over the long run, especially if we stop drilling. So if you own oil companies, now basically the opponents are like Russia and Iran, the bad guys, quote unquote. They are going to make all the money, because we're still going to need oil in 20 years, you know. Not as much maybe if they succeed in all their green ideas, but we're still going to need a lot. And we're not going to be able to produce enough ourselves. So this is one of these places where it seems like truly they believe that they can do without the oil, or otherwise they really shouldn't have stopped Western companies from drilling new oil wells.
Their solutions are all quite dumb with their windmill parks and solar panels, instead of just plonking down a whole series of nuclear plants.
Yeah, well, this also, but that's not entirely, because don't forget that Bill Gates, for example, is building in Iowa, I think, a plant that will produce small-scale nuclear power plants. So it's not. They're also messing around with that stuff. But take that for example, or for example, the guys that believe the vaccine is like a depopulation scheme. I don't think that's the case, but say that were the case, right? Then they're injecting totally the wrong people. Totally the wrong people,
system
right?
conformists are the ones taking
because
it.
Yeah, exactly. And if it does succeed, and it is like a total depopulation thing, you know, then the guys that are left over, they're going to come for their heads. You know, it seems like a very bad strategy.
To me, I think the vaccination is mostly just a way for governments to have an excuse to pull out of the whole lockdown thing, because maybe they realized it was too big a mistake and it was too economically costly.
It's that. It's also that now it just allows for new types of tracking, right? Because if we're all going to have this passport, then they can track how, because now you have to, well, this was the original idea, right? You scan your passport. I think in the UK they actually do this. You scan your passport at every shop and stuff that you go into to show that you are green or whatever. I don't know if it was the UK, but it's probably the UK out of all countries. But I've heard this was being done in places. Yeah. But so this was not. That might have been part of the idea, and of course, I mean, pharmaceutical companies are very interested in this idea that they are going to be able to push a booster shot every year, you know, and if the governments are scared enough, they'll pay anything, and this is what we've seen, right? They've paid absolutely ludicrous sums of money to.
Whereas if they were a real decisive government, they just forced the pharmaceutical companies to provide it for free. Look, it's a pandemic. You got to make sacrifices. We've made sacrifices as a society. You're going to offer us it for free.
Yeah. Although this is, of course, this is where a free market thing becomes difficult, because then the next pandemic, if it's actually for real, your pharmaceutical companies are a lot less interested to invest hardcore into. But yeah, I agree. Yeah. Then you just pump money in them for that one time or whatever.
Sure.
But it's. Yeah, and this was also weird, right? This was Bill Gates, do-gooder extraordinaire. On this particular point, he really didn't want to budge, right? He didn't want to let the patents go free. Yeah, I don't know.
Too much profit to be made there, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever it is. Do you know he owns he's like the biggest landholder in the world now?
Yeah, it's been a trend lately, right? Elites buying up farmland.
Yeah, it's crazy, but he's got a lot.
Yeah.
He's got. I don't remember the percentage, but it was like an actual percentage of the United States that he owned. You know.
Well, it's getting pretty neo-feudal.
It's getting very.
The next step is having serfs.
Well, I think a lot of people are effective serfs already.
Well, the Mexican day laborer who is imported there to work for $7 an hour is essentially a modern day serf, isn't he?
Yeah, I know, but I think a lot of, beyond that even, a lot of people are taking on serfdom as a choice, right? With all these rent-to-own schemes.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point you will own nothing and you will be happy?
Question mark? Happy? I mean, that's one of the examples I always give with like central bank incentives being so perverse. It is really moving towards a own nothing economy where everything is leased. Like most people don't buy their phones; they have them on the abonnement. They take them with the SIM card and so on, and then they roll it over as soon as they can, and they get a new phone. Also not theirs. But lease cars are getting more popular. You can lease fridges now, and it will move to everything.
Yeah, but I think this is also just that.
Well, companies are looking for any way to make profit.
Well, yeah, exactly. But it's also exactly. It's also that almost all things you can own for rent are becoming more expensive, and this is also partially due to the central bank thing, right? But it's like money has become so centralized, and people who have all this centralized wealth, they just want to put it in a place where it generates a return, right? So we're running out of places where you can put money where it generates a return.
Yes.
So
why? Because central banks keep printing money.
This is part of it, exactly. And then if you can just buy, say, 100,000 fridges and you can rent them out, that's the equivalent of owning. Well, if a fridge is 800 euros or whatever, and you buy 100,000 fridges, that's the equivalent of owning, say, like 1,000 apartments and renting them out or something like that, right? Or like 200.
It's a revenue stream which has physical backing.
Exactly, but that's my point, and they really want them, right? I mean, that's why all this farmland is being bought up.
Exactly,
they're just running out of places to put this money.
But it completely centralizes true ownership of things in a very, very small hands.
Into the hands of the Davos crowd.
Yes.
Yeah, this is and this is part which rebelling against this is like anti-libertarian, but in another way it is absolutely libertarian, because the way these people got all this wealth is
completely
due to cronyism. Yeah, exactly. So it's
central banks do not fit in the libertarian worldview.
Yeah, so I suppose
neither do roads, but that's the second matter.
Well, I mean, let's not go there.
Yeah.
But it's very strange but this turning, it's very much turning against the Davos crowd, and it's not turning in favor of us. Although, of course, like one of the main people who
us
dislike
being
us make up a large percentage of the Davos crowd, one might say, but...
but us being, it's not turning really towards traditionalism, reactionaries, or...
Nay, which is still a problem, right? Because if we're not going to start pumping out babies, then we're still then that's still a problem,
Yeah.
So this still needs to... If anything, we need to turn it into some... that's the main thing. We just need to get these wombs working, That's like... if we can at least turn it into a direction where our birth rate is, our fertility rate, is 2+, then we can bide our time for the next one. Although I think the world will be so different by then. This is something that we were talking about.
Yeah, we've talked this a few times about.
So maybe that doesn't even
AI.
matter anymore. I don't know. Because think about how close we are with the whole embryo selection thing as well. I think the next 80-year cycle, I can't even imagine what it might look like. So
humanity might be fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And this is why we are also racing against the clock, because we only have so much time to take back control towards the good, the beautiful, and the virtuous. Otherwise, all these tools will be in the hands of people who are completely, they're degenerates and it's drunk on power.
It's even worse for the Chinese, right? This is something that we have, I think, also talked about before, but the Chinese only have X amount of time left to overthrow their government. Otherwise, they're never going to come out from under Xi's boot,
Well, not internally. There might, of course, be external, but yes.
Yeah, because it becomes cheaper and cheaper and easier to process all the data to surveil everybody, and you can have more and more centralized control over just a select number of trusted individuals running a large farm of autonomous drones that just control people, right?
Yeah.
And then you don't even need... Then the police can't rebel because there's no police. The military can't rebel because instead of having a military, you just do some cyber attacks and maybe just launch missiles and that's it. You don't even do land warfare anymore. I don't know. But... and otherwise you just have drones striking the shit out of everything.
The thing is, you're gonna have to have some pretty damn good technology to make sure that some dirt peasant goat fucker with an AK doesn't mess you up, because those are still incredibly hard to suppress if they have any kind of numbers.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to control the enclaves out in buttfuck nowhere, right? But then again, in a cyberpunk-esque world, does that even matter? You just take the protein from the protein farmers and ship it into your horrible cities, and you don't even care what's going on the outside.
I guess that's to an extent what would be happening to the US if the US didn't suffer from this ideology which feels the need that every little backwater treehouse town needs to be diverse and needs to be progressive, because it's very imperialist in that way. You need to conform. They can't leave you alone.
Yeah. This is true. But again, that might change. This is also something we were talking in the car on the way home. I've often thought about, I don't like paying taxes to the Dutch government because I know these taxes are being used to undermine what I like. So I've often thought about leaving, right? And I thought, I was looking around and, as you do, you think Hungary. Mm-hmm. But then Hungary is now one of the worst ones on the whole COVID thing. Oh, fuck. On the disease that shall not be named thing.
Yeah.
But so then that's not a thing either, right? So now I'm like, well, that doesn't give me any faith for the future. So, and then you said, well, maybe you're just better off, staying put and going for like an enclave.
But I think the real way moving forward, the only really realistic solution we have for the time being is parallelism, building our own little enclaves, building our own institutions, being as self-sufficient as possible.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we can't. Yeah, you don't know what will happen in Hungary, and you can't keep relying on foreign governments. Maybe, like that's what the White Russians did, right? After Soviet Union took over, right? They went to like Berlin and Shanghai, and they or try to organize resistance from there. But no, the Soviet Union lasted for 80, 90 years.
Yeah, but at least they didn't live in the fucking Soviet Union, you know. Were you better off in an enclave within the Soviet Union, or would you have rather lived in Hong Kong?
No, you'd probably be dead if you were in an enclave.
Exactly. So to some degree, fleeing is sensible.
When it gets to that level, yes. But I don't think our governments, especially in Europe, will start decaying into such totalitarian.
And also,
in England they will. I mean, the Anglos are really fucked.
It's always weird to see how much worse they are.
Yeah.
You know, the whole surveillance thing. I've got a because I want to read mainstream news, and I hate most Dutch mainstream news. So I've got a subscription to the weekend edition of the Financial Times, right? And sometimes, you know, you were looking at it a second ago as well. You know, the level. There was an article about surveillance, the surveillance state, and the level of, you know, that they were thinking, because London is of course full of CCTV cameras, and I always forget we barely have any over here.
No, barely.
And only on the highways. On the highways, they're full of them.
Yeah, but that's speed cameras.
No. We've got speed cameras, but you've also got all of these cameras checking traffic, and they're officially there to track how busy the roads are. I know for particular reasons. I know quite a bit about this. So officially, they're only tracking how busy the streets are, and they don't register more data. But you know as well as I do
that's very prone to abuse.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, our roads are full of CCTV cameras, and I'm pretty sure if the police wants to, they can tap into that and track exactly how a car drove around.
They probably could. That's the thing, that under our current laws they would have to have dispensation for that, which would have to be ruled by a judge.
But under our current laws, you can't look down like that just all of a sudden.
Yeah. The thing is, with our current laws are just very shaky. That's the whole thing. Why the lawyers were concerned. It's like there doesn't seem to be proper rule of law on some things anymore.
No, I mean, a lot of this stuff just was undefined, right? They just did it.
Yeah.
And the order of lawyers, if they were going to do anything, they should have sued the government.
Should have acted earlier, yeah. But that's the thing with the social pressure. No lawyer wants to go and step forward and take that case and be called a lobby.
But that's what I mean with green shoots in this whole thing. One of the most, one of the most high status guys around as far as doing these big class action lawsuits, Reiner Fulmich. He's doing that, you know.
But isn't he being ostracized as well by the papers and?
Oh yes, for sure. But the thing is, he's got so much status within his occupation, as far as I understand. It's not like I'm like an insider on this whole lawyer culture thing, but as far as I understand, because he was like the big winner with the whole Dieselgate thing, right? So all these papers were writing like he's the most amazing guy doing all this and taking, because he was doing what the narrative wanted, coincidentally, that time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now that he's not doing, but that of course that causes a lot of cognitive dissonance for
people.
A
lot of people, like what this
he was the great guy. What are you talking about?
But then a lot of people will go, either they go through the stages of grief, or they'll just dismiss it as saying, "Oh, he probably turned crazy."
Yeah, of course, but which is what people with cognitive dissonance do, but. That's the thing about a fourth turning, you know, about being halfway. There's just more and more of this shit happens, and it becomes more and more difficult to dismiss, you know.
Yes.
And that's exactly what we noticed, that there's just an increasing number of people that are unable to dismiss it, and they are actually starting
we noticed it in the far right as such, of course, with just this sudden influx of a whole lot of highly educated people who weren't like the typical skinheads who used to form the movement. That was a shift. That was a very clear shift, and that was one of the first.
And then you've got the highly educated people turning into skinheads.
Sometimes this happens. People do go off the rails sometimes.
But this is true. Yeah, although that's also. I wonder, you know, are we going to see, because, I mean, this process takes time, right? So these people that are getting, that they're getting their system shocked now, are they going to go really nuts, you know, in the next 5 months, you know, 6 months?
It's possible. I mean, the red pill rage thing.
It's real, right?
It's
so
real,
they're going to go nuts. That's going to be very interesting. Or maybe it's...
And maybe, couldn't you say that some of them already have with like the anti-lockdown protests and stuff?
Oh, well, yes, well, but that's... But a lot of these people are already loosely hinged, you know? So a lot of the people... I wish I really should go to one of these protests once. I really want to taste the atmosphere and talk to some people there and see... I want to know what their thinking is.
From people that have been there, I've heard that it's a bit hippie-ish, really. Very
but these
are... Freedom sort of thing.
I mean, these are... The whole Waldorfschule guys are, of course, on that. Which is also making me think it's not turning that way. Because it's also turning a lot more in that direction as well, you know? I notice. You know? It seems that that the number of these... you know, Germanic, semi-pagan, I don't know what exactly. It's like the what's it? Waldorfschule, and what was the guy called?
The one, the Vogel Steiner?
Steiner.
Yes.
It's taking a bit of a Steiner-esque turn as well.
Rudolf Steiner becoming the savior of the West. Now that's a turn I want to
Yeah, well, which is diametrically opposed to some degrees, according to Steiner anyways, to some of the people we like. Yeah. Well, I like Steiner
if we do start turning towards a sort of Steinerian cult of nature, that's
Steinerian libertarianism.
Yes.
Well, that's going to be a new...
I actually don't think that would be too bad.
No, me neither.
Be alright. Yeah.
Well, if we can push it in that direction, you know, but that's very implicitly white, you know. Nobody else will feel at home.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Like, not even Spanish people will like that.
No, that's like tree hugging and worshipping nature, that sort of thing.
So what you say is we should start a mushroom cult. That'll be
you
really
and your mushrooms.
Like that's the key to all of this, you know.
Psychedelics.
Yes, this is
I was thinking the other day.
A required ingredient.
I was thinking the other day, like you know, Indians and Vikings. They're really not that different. They've got shamans. They do psychedelic drugs.
Right.
They wear animal skins. They violently attack their neighbors and do horrible things to them.
So you mean any primitive people so far?
Yes. Very similar. But
yes. You know, the Aryan hordes, you know, they did the Amanita muscaria mushroom, and they wore animal skins.
Yeah, they slaughtered everyone.
They all slaughtered their neighbors. Yeah. You know, it's like interesting.
Yeah.
I think in the Amazon they do psychedelics.
Yes,
and they slaughter their neighbors.
Yes.
Interesting.
You'd almost think it's some sort of fundamental human nature when it's not in civilization or something.
I really do wonder though if Bill Gates or one of these guys, you know, that definitely don't have a clean conscience, you know. I really wonder what would happen to them if they took like a serious dose of mushrooms. I think it would be horrible.
So what you're saying is we need to organize some kind of secret mission to spike Bill Gates' drinks or something.
Yeah, and I don't know what would happen to the guy. Maybe nothing, you know. Maybe it also depends on other stuff. But
it's also how sociopathic they are. I don't think Jeff Bezos can be redeemed, for example.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. You saw the petition that he shouldn't come back from space, right?
Yes.
We don't want him. Just stay.
Yeah.
You know, you can go to Mars.
But don't come back.
Fucking.
I still like Elon Musk the most out of all of those guys.
Yeah, even though he's a fucking crook as well.
He is, but at least he's a funny crook.
Yeah, and he's explicit about how. Well, he's not actually explicit, but he's not like. He's as explicit as you get for being like.
We're gonna round this off now.
Yeah, that's all going to get cut off.
And the conclusion of this podcast is drink spring water from Liechtenstein and build parallel institutions.
Yes, and make sure nobody ever duct tapes a pen to Alex Jones' ankle.
Yes, something like that. Yes.
De love wat je die verdwijnen en de sterke blijft bestaan. Je moet vechten voor je rechten, zo is altijd nog gegaan. De lafaards die verdwijnen en de sterke blijft bestaan. Je moet vechten voor je rechten, zo is het altijd nog gegaan. Zonder weerstand laat je leiders wakken naar de slag. Ze ontnemen stil je rechten, dit stond voor de tv en lach. De lafaards die verdwijnen en de sterke blijft bestaan. Je moet vechten voor je rechten, zo is altijd nog gegaan. De lafaards die verdwijnen en de sterke blijft bestaan. Je moet vechten voor je rechten, zo is het altijd nog gegaan. Zo is het altijd nog gegaan. Zo is het altijd nog gegaan.